In the Kremlin, money no longer saves the situation. Reserves melt before our eyes, the budget crumbles, and inside Russia, it's starting to boil. Elites are nervous, scandals are surfacing, the system is bursting at the seams. What was hidden under the rug for years is now coming out. Meanwhile, Belarus can't seem to sit on two chairs at once. The army is growing, drills are non-stop, and yet Lukashenko suddenly changes his tone. What are they planning in Minsk? And where is the truth? The West is taking its support for Ukraine to a new level. Ukraine is getting more precise, long-range, and large-scale tools that shift the balance on the battlefield. Tension rises, the system shakes, and everyone feels it's going to get even tougher. We'll talk about all of this right now. Greetings! This is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafanova with the latest events. It seems the most dangerous stage of the war is starting in the Kremlin, a stage where money can no longer solve the main problems. For years, Russian authorities told their people that reserves would cover everything: war, sanctions, and endless geopolitical adventures. But now there are more signs that the economic safety net is rapidly shrinking. Reserves melt, the deficit grows, and the gold meant for a rainy day is being traded to keep the system afloat. The irony is that even money no longer guarantees the Kremlin's salvation. Russian industry is operating almost at the limit of its capacity. Factories lack people, and sanctions keep cutting off access to critical technologies. It's an absurd picture. Moscow can find new billions but faces problems that money alone can't solve. The money is there, but the opportunities are fading. And that's why Russia is sinking deeper into dependence on China. A country that boasted of its greatness and self-sufficiency now looks like a client living on credit, hoping the bank won't call in the debt early. Beijing remains the main supplier of tech, components, and financial routes to bypass sanctions. But even there, they know, the Russian economy is gradually losing its margin of safety. As economic problems pile up, other, no less dangerous symptoms appear. When resources dwindle, the struggle for influence, money, and the leader's favor intensifies in any authoritarian system. And this can be much more dangerous than sanctions or budget holes. And it seems this is where the most interesting part begins. Because lately things are happening in the Kremlin that seemed impossible not long ago. One by one, people from Putin's inner circle find themselves at the center of scandals. Elites are nervous, and the system that showed a facade of unity is suddenly starting to crack. What's really happening behind the closed doors of the Kremlin offices? And why is Moscow talking more about problems that can no longer be hidden? All the details are in our report. The Kremlin corridors are once again smelling of personnel panic. For weeks, Russian telegram channels have relished rumors that Dmitry Peskov might not return from vacation as the Kremlin's main voice. Rumors suggest Putin's longtime spokesperson might be sent far from Moscow's intrigues into diplomatic exile under the fancy guise of embassy work. And while Peskov himself remains silent, Russia's information space has exploded with a new theory. Supposedly, Dmitry Kiselyov is being considered for his spot, a man who for years turned television broadcasts into a propaganda factory and apocalyptic forecast for the West. It seems the Kremlin decided that if reality is becoming harder to explain, they need a specialist with an especially powerful imagination. Some are already joking that the personnel changes might be linked to the fact that lately Peskov has been appearing too often at various social events and parties suspiciously far from state work. Or maybe the reason is much simpler. The Kremlin traditionally looks for someone to blame for failures, and when there is no good news, they have to change at least those who announce it. Though for now, all of this remains at the level of rumors and insider tips. However, when even the main Kremlin spokesperson suddenly finds himself at the center of personnel gossip, it may indicate that nervousness in Russia's power corridors continues to grow. At the center of another conflict is the main guardian of Russian finances, Elvira Nabiullina. After a mysterious 2-week disappearance from the public eye, she finally appeared at a briefing, but instead of soothing tales of stability, she brought Putin a new batch of unpleasant news. The head of the central bank effectively admitted that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries could trigger a new spiral of inflation and hit the country's economy hard. It seems Nabiullina is increasingly saying things that the Kremlin would prefer not to hear. While propaganda reports on an economic miracle and resilience to sanctions, the head of the central bank stubbornly points out risks, deficits, and budget problems. The situation with the ruble could cause particular irritation. The Russian currency unexpectedly strengthened, but instead of a triumph, it turned into a headache for the authorities. Exporters are losing profits, the budget is missing out on billions, and economists are already warning of a multi-trillion hole in state finances. Against this backdrop, Russian elite circles are increasingly discussing the future of Nabiullina herself. Her term ends in 2027, and rumors about the search for a successor have long since moved beyond the corridors of power. Various names are mentioned, but the main question is different. Has the head of the central bank become too inconvenient for the Kremlin? And while Nabiullina was previously considered one of the most effective managers of Putin's system, now her position increasingly resembles a classic Kremlin trap. When the economy stalls, money becomes scarcer, and the war demands more resources, a scapegoat will have to be found sooner or later. And it's quite possible that the role of such a scapegoat is already being prepared specifically for the head of the Russian central bank. The unpleasant surprises for the Russian Federation don't end there. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin received a very unusual gift for his birthday. While the official was likely receiving more congratulations from Kremlin colleagues, his Telegram channel suddenly turned into a platform for completely unexpected political statements. One after another, posts supporting Ukraine began appearing in the feed, along with openly mocking messages about the Russian authorities and war supporters. These were likely the most sincere posts ever to appear on the Moscow mayor's official channel. However, it didn't last long. After a wave of public outcry, all the messages quickly vanished, as if they had never even existed. But as we know, the internet remembers everything, and screenshots had already spread across the web faster than Moscow officials could explain the situation. It's particularly symbolic that the incident happened right on Sobyanin's birthday. Instead of birthday cards and pompous greetings, the mayor got a real information firework display. If this truly was a hack, the unknown authors decided to throw him a party in the style of modern Russian reality, with panic, chaos, and a total lack of control over what's happening. For years, the Kremlin has boasted of total control over the information space, but sometimes just a few minutes are enough for the official channel of one of the country's most influential officials to become a source of news that makes Russian propagandists clutch their hearts. It seems the Kremlin's main problem today is no longer sanctions or even Ukrainian strikes. The most dangerous enemy for Putin's system is becoming internal chaos, which is increasingly difficult to hide behind propaganda, loud statements, and TV shows about stability. And as more cracks appear on the facade of this system, the question grows louder: is everything in Russia really as calm as they say on the screen? In Belarus, it seems that processes are underway that force a closer look at Ukraine's northern border. The Belarusian opposition has handed a report to the Ukrainian side, detailing signs of large-scale preparations by the Lukashenko regime for a possible military scenario. And the list looks quite alarming. From legislative changes allowing so-called preventive strikes and the use of the army abroad, to the rapid buildup of military forces and the creation of new commands near the Ukrainian border. We're not talking about individual decisions, but about an entire system. According to the report's authors, Belarus is actively increasing its mobilization reserve, adopting Russian recruitment practices, expanding military infrastructure, and shifting more resources to defense needs. In just a few years, military spending has increased manifold, and the defense industry has effectively become part of the Russian war machine. The level of military integration with Moscow looks even more alarming. Russian troops are already in Belarus, tactical nuclear weapons are deployed, along with missile systems that the Kremlin presents as one of its main trump cards. At the same time, roads, bridges, and airfields are being modernized for moving heavy equipment, and the country lives in a state of almost continuous military exercises. There are also less noticeable details. In Belarus, thousands of bomb shelters are being checked, strategic fuel reserves are being built up, lists of civilian equipment for possible mobilization are being expanded, and even the medical system is being prepared for large-scale combat. It seems the country is gradually being put on standby for a scenario that no one has officially announced, but for which they are very diligently preparing. And this is where it gets interesting. After all these preparations, Lukashenko suddenly started singing a different tune. The same leader who for years threatened his neighbors and showed readiness to support any Kremlin adventures is now increasingly emphasizing his reluctance to fight. And whether it's a coincidence or not, this shift in rhetoric became especially noticeable after the tough statements by Volodymyr Zelensky, who made it clear Ukraine sees every move Minsk makes, knows about every facility working for the war, and is no longer going to limit itself to just warnings. It seems that after this signal, Minsk suddenly realized loud statements are one thing, but responsibility for real actions can turn out to be something else entirely. That's why today Belarusian officials are increasingly talking about peace and de-escalation. But what's really behind this unexpected transformation of a fearsome ally into a peaceful Lukashenko? Let's find out. In Minsk, they're hitting the panic button as hard as they can. Lukashenko, who for years tried to look like a fearsome Kremlin ally and regularly threatened neighbors with all possible punishments, has gone suspiciously quiet in recent days. Following Volodymyr Zelensky's tough statements regarding Belarusian involvement in facilitating Russian attacks from its territory, official Minsk has unexpectedly shifted into a mode of cautious excuses and demonstrative peacefulness. It's particularly interesting how the Belarusian authorities suddenly started emphasizing that they are not taking part in the war. The first signal was a strange story involving a statement by Sergei Lavrov. Belarusian state media unexpectedly cut the loudest part of his quote about how those who try to drag Belarus into the war will regret it. Only a convenient phrase remained, stating that Minsk supposedly isn't participating in the conflict. It looks as if in the Belarusian offices they suddenly decided bellicose rhetoric might bring more trouble than benefit right now. The second warning bell was Defense Minister Viktor Krenina. The same official who, at the start of the full-scale invasion, spoke about the lack of threats to Ukraine from Belarusian territory, is now actively explaining that it makes no sense for Belarus to get involved in the war. Until recently, Minsk loved showing off missiles, drills, and fierce statements, but now the main message has become, we don't want to fight at all. It seems the rhetoric has changed so sharply that even the propagandists can't always keep up with the new party line. The third signal came from the Secretary of the Security Council of Belarus, Alexander Volfovich. He also suddenly started talking about the need to end the war as soon as possible and about Minsk's desire to avoid any involvement in the conflict. And here a rather amusing contrast arises. Just recently, Lukashenko, with a serious look, was demonstrating nuclear ambitions and talking about readiness to respond to any challenges. And now, official Minsk increasingly resembles a person who was shouting over a fence and then suddenly realized the gates were left wide open. The problem for the Belarusian leadership is that statements alone won't fix the situation anymore, as Ukraine and the West see the reality perfectly well. The Belarusian military-industrial complex is working in the interests of the Russian war machine. Part of the logistics is provided through the country's territory and the infrastructure is used to support Russian operations. Therefore, the current campaign about not wanting to fight looks more like an attempt to urgently distance themselves from potential consequences than a real policy change. And while Lukashenko could previously afford to play the role of the Kremlin's loudest ally, the situation now looks quite different. In Minsk, it seems they're realizing more and more that the longer the war lasts, the costlier participation becomes, even in indirect forms of support for Russia. So the Belarusian authorities today resemble a passenger who happily sat next to the driver for years, but now suddenly started nervously asking if it's time to get out of the car. The only question is whether it's too late for Minsk to start thinking about this. And this is exactly where it becomes clear why Minsk suddenly started talking so much about peace and not wanting to fight. Volodymyr Zelensky publicly presented Lukashenko with the bill for years of indirect participation in the war on the Kremlin's side. And we're no longer talking about political statements or diplomatic gestures, but about very specific objects. The president of Ukraine reported 4 Russian relay stations in the Gomel and Brest regions, which are used to coordinate Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. According to Zelensky, the enemy used these systems to attack the Zhytomyr, Rivne and Volyn regions, as well as energy and railway infrastructure facilities. In other words, while Minsk spoke of its neutrality, Russian drones were receiving help from Belarusian territory for more precise targeting of Ukrainian objectives. And now Kyiv is saying directly, it's time to decide. Zelensky emphasized that the Ukrainian side has repeatedly passed information to Minsk through intelligence and other channels. In simple terms, first there were warnings behind closed doors, then there were signals, and now the public stage has begun. And it was right after this that a real campaign about non-participation in the war and not wanting to be dragged into the conflict suddenly began in the Belarusian media. The president's statement that Lukashenko's repeated excuses no longer interest anyone sounded particularly harsh because over the years of war, Kyiv has learned to judge actions, not words. And the actions are quite telling. Belarusian enterprises work for the Russian military-industrial complex, fuel continues to flow to the Russian army, and technical infrastructure is used for attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has effectively issued an ultimatum: the relay stations must be dismantled. Moreover, either Belarus can do it itself or Ukraine will solve the problem with its own forces. The formula was as simple as it gets: either them or us. And judging by the nervous activity of Belarusian officials in recent days, Minsk has understood perfectly well that this time it's not just another diplomatic exchange of statements. So it's possible that all this sudden peacefulness from Belarusian officials has a very mundane explanation. After years of playing the game of we're not fighting but we're helping, Lukashenko was directly told for the first time the era of half measures is ending. And now Minsk faces a choice that is becoming increasingly difficult to postpone. It seems a new unpleasant surprise is being prepared for the Russian Shaheds. While the Kremlin tries to exhaust Ukrainian air defense with nightly attacks, Europe has found a way to make drone hunting much cheaper and far more effective. Czechia is promoting the idea of transferring 10 L-39NG Skyfox aircraft to Ukraine. Machines that until recently were considered ordinary trainer aircraft but are now turning into real hunters of aerial targets. The irony of the situation is that Russia spends huge resources on producing and launching hundreds of drones, while they can be shot down by planes based on legendary Czech flying desks. After modernization, the Skyfox received new weaponry and guided missiles which allow for effective interception of aerial targets. In other words, another very dangerous predator may appear in the sky for Russian drones. The most interesting thing is that it's not Ukraine that's being asked to pay for these planes. Czechia wants the funding to be covered by countries that have already provided Kyiv with F-16s. It's quite a symbolic picture. While the Kremlin has been talking for years about the alleged fatigue of the West, allies continue to look for new ways to strengthen Ukraine's defense. And not just with expensive fighters, but also with solutions that save resources and shoot down aerial targets more effectively. For Moscow, this is bad news also because the war is increasingly turning into a technological competition. And while Russian generals celebrate every launch of another wave of Shaheds, Europe is already thinking about how to make these attacks futile. It seems that in the future, Russian drones will have to fear not only air defense missiles, but a whole pack of new aerial hunters. Ukraine's allies are no longer thinking about how to simply contain Russian aggression. They are increasingly active in creating tools capable of reaching where the Kremlin felt completely unreachable just yesterday. And right now, a process may be starting, the consequences of which the Russian leadership will feel for many years to come. What the Kremlin has feared in recent years may become a reality. The West is not only not reducing military support for Ukraine, but is also starting to put a new generation of long-range missiles into production. And if the plans of defense companies are realized, the count could go into hundreds and even thousands of high-precision weapons for the Ukrainian army. The first wake-up call for Moscow was the news from the Netherlands. There, they announced funding for the production of 700 long-range cruise missiles from the Destinus company specifically for Ukraine. And this is just one program. At the same time, reports continue to circulate about Ukraine's use of new long-range ERAM missiles with a stated range of over 930 kilometers. That's not even the most interesting part. According to some estimates, we could be talking about future deliveries not in single batches, but on a scale that will be counted in the thousands. For the Russian military command, such a prospect looks almost like a strategic nightmare. After all, if before one could try to hide warehouses, headquarters, and military plants far in the rear, now the very concept of safe depth is beginning to crumble. From Belgorod to the Urals, from military airfields to defense industry enterprises, all of this is gradually falling into the zone of potential risk. But the real intrigue is unfolding in Great Britain. Defense giant MBDA reported successful tests of the new crossbow drone missile. And here, what's especially painful for the Kremlin isn't even the 800-kilometer range or the 300-kilogram warhead. The speed of development is impressive. Only 9 months passed from the initial idea to a finished prototype. In fact, the British demonstrated that modern high-precision weapons can now be created faster than Russian officials can write another report about having no analogs. And crossbow is just one part of a much larger story. As part of the British Breakstep project, several more long-range systems are being created in parallel. For example, Tiger Shark is capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 1,000 kilometers carrying a 300-kilogram warhead. And its cost is just over $500,000, which by modern military standards looks like an almost budget-friendly option. Even more interesting is Skylance, with a claimed range of up to 1,200 kilometers. One detail adds a particular piquancy to the situation. All these systems are created according to the ITAR-free principle. In simple terms, without American components that could restrict the transfer of weapons to third countries. That is, the British deliberately designed these missiles so that in the future they could be transferred to Ukraine quickly and without unnecessary bureaucracy. For the Kremlin, this is a very unpleasant signal. There are fewer and fewer political levers left to block such supplies. What looks most symbolic is how the West's very approach has changed. While at the start of the full-scale war, allies argued even about transferring individual artillery systems, now it's increasingly about joint production, multi-year funding programs, and creating entire lines of long-range weapons specifically for Ukraine's needs. In effect, a new defense ecosystem is forming in which Ukraine is no longer just a recipient of aid, but one of the key centers of future European security. It's funny that Putin started this war under slogans about the demilitarization of Ukraine. A few years have passed, and now Ukraine is gaining access to technologies it could previously only dream of. The West is launching new production lines, funding hundreds and thousands of long-range systems. If these programs are implemented even partially, then for many Russian facilities, the coming years may turn out to be much less peaceful than the Kremlin is used to counting on. For Russians, nightly alarms are becoming as much a routine part of life as morning coffee. Before Moscow could recover from previous attacks, the sky over Russia and the occupied territories was again filled with the sounds of explosions and sirens. Everything looked most symbolic in the Russian capital itself. While officials reported on more successful interceptions over the Moscow region, drones flew by one after another. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin spent the night practically in real-time counting new targets approaching the city. According to him, nearly 60 drones were allegedly shot down on the outskirts of Moscow. The irony is that the more such reports appear, the harder it is for Russians to believe in fairy tales about the absolute safety of the capital. Powerful explosions also rang out in Bryansk. Holy shit! That's crazy. According to local reports, railway infrastructure was hit, one of the key arteries through which Russian military logistics are supplied. For the Kremlin, this is a particularly painful topic because while generals dream of new offensives, more and more rear facilities are forced to think not about cargo transport, but about their own survival. It was no less heated in occupied Crimea. Explosions were heard there in several districts of the peninsula at once. Special attention was drawn to the Tavriiska thermal power plant near Simferopol, one of the key energy facilities that Russia once built as a symbol of the final integration of occupied Crimea into its own system. Now, this symbol is increasingly in the news due to damage, fires, and the consequences of attacks. After previous strikes, burnt-out structures, holes, and serious destruction have already been recorded there. Events in Armyansk unfolded in an even more interesting way. According to preliminary information, the strike hit the FSB border service building near the railway station. A fire started after the explosion, and eyewitnesses reported further detonations. When security forces' facilities start exploding, even the most staunch supporters of Kremlin TV shows suddenly start asking very uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of the entire defense system. Reports of explosions also came from Donetsk and Berdyansk. In the latter, special attention was drawn to the railway station area, where a fire broke out after the attack. And this once again demonstrates one simple trend. The geography of strikes is constantly expanding, and the list of objects that the Russian authorities considered relatively safe is rapidly shrinking. The final statistics from the Russian Ministry of Defense look particularly telling. They claimed that 301 Ukrainian drones were allegedly shot down in one night. And here a rather uncomfortable paradox arises. If the threat is indeed so massive that they have to report hundreds of targets over dozens of regions, then Russia itself effectively admits the air war has long since gone far beyond the front lines. And while Kremlin officials continue to talk about control over the situation, Russian regions are increasingly waking up not to alarm clocks, but to explosions. And it seems that for many residents of Russia, this is becoming a new, very unpleasant reality. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, give us a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode!